Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm bringing you a story that is incredibly difficult but also incredibly important. It's a case that has literally changed the history and approach to domestic violence, not just in the United States, but around the world. Today we're going to talk about Tracey Thurman and what happened to her in the 1980s in the small town of Torrington, Connecticut. I should warn you up front that this story contains sensitive topics of domestic violence and brutal assault, so if those topics trigger you, it may be best to skip the video. As I think about this case, I keep asking myself, how is it possible that someone calls the police over and over again, asking for help, and yet is ignored? How is it possible that a woman can be lying on the ground in a pool of her own blood while police officers just stand by? And how is it possible that it is because of this horrific failure of the system that laws were finally changed and thousands of lives were saved? Tracey Thurman was not just a statistic. She was a young mother trying to protect herself and her child. She was a woman who did everything right, reported the violence, asked for help, got court orders, and yet the system failed her in the worst possible way. But her story doesn't end in tragedy. It's a story of strength, courage, and how one woman was able to change an entire system. So make yourself comfortable because this is going to be a long video, but I promise you it's worth watching all the way through. Let's take a look at the Tracey Thurman case together. Before we get into what actually happened, we first need to get an idea of who Tracey Thurman actually was. You know, when people talk about victims of domestic violence, they often become just numbers, just statistics. But Tracey was a living woman, with her own dreams, hopes, and plans for the future. She wasn't just a victim, she was a person first. A young woman and mother of a young son, Tracey Thurman, was a young American woman living in Connecticut. When we look at photographs from that time, we see an ordinary young woman, someone we might meet on the street, in a shop, anywhere. Nothing about her suggested that she would one day become a symbol of the fight against domestic violence and change the entire legal system in the United States. Her greatest treasure was her young son. He was probably born around the year 1981, which means that he was a toddler, barely a 2-year-old boy when the key events of this story took place. Imagine that. You have a young child who is totally dependent on you, who needs your love, care, and most of all, protection. As a mother, your main instinct is to protect your child at all costs, and that's exactly what Tracey did. She tried to provide her son with a safe home, stability, and the love that every child needs and deserves. Being a young mother is challenging in itself. It is a time filled with joy, but also with fatigue, worry, and questions. Are you doing it right? How best to care for your baby? How to protect him from the dangers of this world? For most mothers, these dangers are abstract. Illnesses, accidents, strangers. But for Tracey, the threat came from a place she should never have, from the father of her own child. Life in Torrington, Connecticut. Torrington is a small town in northwestern Connecticut. It's not some big metropolis, not a place that's commonly talked about in the newspapers. It's a typical American town where people know each other, where you have your neighbors, where you go to the same stores. In the year 1982, Torrington had a population of about 30,000 people, big enough to have its own police department, but small enough that people think that everybody knows everybody here somehow. This was the town Tracey lived in. She didn't live in her own house. After leaving her husband, she had to seek refuge elsewhere. She lived with friends or relatives, as is often the case in such situations. When you leave an abusive partner, you often have nowhere to go. You don't have a place of your own. You often don't have enough money because you may not have been able to work or your partner didn't give you access to finance. You are dependent on the kindness of others, on the willingness of someone to provide a roof over your head and that of your child. Tracey was described as a Connecticut housewife at the time. That was her role, her identity at the time these events took place. She was taking care of the household, taking care of her child. She didn't have a career that defined her. She didn't have any famous accomplishments or awards. She was just an ordinary woman trying to survive and protect her child. Her relationship with Charles Thurman. Charles Thurman, nicknamed Buck, was the man Tracey married. She adopted his surname, as was common at the time. She became Tracey Thurman. They had a child together, a young son who was named after his father, Charles Jr. But how did they meet? How did their relationship begin? That's a question we don't have a clear answer to, unfortunately. The available sources focus mainly on what went wrong, on the violence, on the assault, on the trial. No one at the time was interested in how the young couple met, what their first dates were like, whether Buck was nice and considerate at the beginning, as is often the case in relationships that end in violence. But we can surmise that there must have been love in the beginning, or at least what Tracey considered love. No one marries someone they don't love. No one chooses to have a child with someone they don't trust. In the beginning, there must have been dreams of a future together, of a happy family, of a home full of love. But sometimes those dreams turn into a nightmare. And that's what happened to Tracey. Trying to live a normal life. You know, when I read about Tracey Thurman's case, the one thing that strikes me most is how hard she tried to live a normal life. Even when she was in a relationship that was increasingly violent and dangerous, even when she was scared and hurt, she was still trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for herself, and especially for her child. What does it mean to want a normal life? It means wanting to get up in the morning without fear. It means wanting to leave the house without having to look over your shoulder. It means wanting your child to grow up safe and calm. It means simply living without the constant threat of violence. Tracey was not a woman who would sit at home and passively wait to be rescued. She was a woman who was actively trying to change her situation. When she realized that her relationship was dangerous, she took one of the hardest steps a victim of domestic violence can take. She left. She took her child and left. Do you know how hard that is? Statistics show that a victim of domestic violence leaves an average of 7 times before she leaves for good. 7 times. Why is that? Because it's scary. Because you often have nowhere to go. Because your partner has convinced you that they'll change. Because you're afraid of what will happen if you leave. And it's that last fear that is the most compelling. Statistics clearly show that the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when they leave or shortly after. Tracey has done it all. She left. She took her child and tried to start a new life. She sought help. She turned to the system that was designed to protect her. She believed that if she did everything right, she'd be safe. Unfortunately, the reality was very different. When you try to imagine who Tracey Thurman was, imagine a young mother who got up every morning, hoping that today would be a better day. Imagine a woman who gave breakfast to her young son and tried to explain to him why he no longer lived with his daddy. Imagine someone who was trying to build a new life from the rubble of the old one. Tracey wasn't a superhero. She wasn't a lawyer who knew all the laws. She wasn't an activist who fought for women's rights. She was just an ordinary woman who found herself in an extremely difficult situation and tried to get out of it the best way she knew how. And that's what's so powerful about her story, because Tracey could have been any one of us. She could have been your neighbor, your colleague, your friend. Domestic violence doesn't discriminate. It affects women of all ages, all races, all walks of life. And Tracey was proof that even if you do everything right, even if you seek help, the system can fail you. But her story also shows something else. It shows strength and determination. Because even when the system failed her in the worst possible way, Tracey didn't give up. Even when she suffered something that would break most people, she found the strength to keep fighting. But all that would come later. For now, it's important to remember that Tracey Thurman wasn't just a name in a legal case. She was a living, breathing woman with a child, with dreams and with hopes. She was someone who deserved to be safe. She was someone the system was supposed to protect. And that's why her story is so important and so heartbreaking. October of the year 1982. An autumn month when the leaves of Connecticut's trees begin to change color, when the air turns cooler and the evenings come earlier. For most people in Torrington, it was a normal month. Kids went to school, people went to work. Life went on at its usual pace. But for Tracey, this month was the start of something no one should have to experience. It was the beginning of a reign of terror that would last for months and nearly cost her her life. The first attacks and threats from Charles October 1982 marked an escalation. Buck Thurman became increasingly aggressive and his behavior could no longer be ignored or excused. You know, when we talk about domestic violence, people often think it starts all at once, that one day everything is fine, and the next day someone attacks you. But the reality is much more complex. Domestic violence usually starts in stages. First, it's just verbal abuse, then it's controlling, isolation from friends and family, and then it's physical violence. And even that physical violence has its gradations. In October of 1982, Buck's behavior reached a new level. He began actively threatening Tracey, and it wasn't just empty words or threats thrown out in anger. They were specific, terrifying threats that made Tracey live in constant fear. He was telling her that he was going to hurt her. He told her he would kill her. And you know what the worst part is? When someone says things like that over and over again, you start to believe them. You start living in constant expectation that it's really going to happen. Buck didn't just threaten Tracey with words. He started physically assaulting her. Imagine the horror. The person you shared your life with, the person you have a child with, the person you once trusted, suddenly becomes your attacker. The arms that once embraced you are now hurting you. The voice that once spoke kind words to you now shouts insults and threats. The details of these first assaults are not all publicly documented, which is unfortunately common in domestic violence cases. Victims often don't want to talk about every single incident. It's too painful, too embarrassing, too traumatic. But we know that the assaults were serious enough for Tracey to understand that she was in danger. They were frightening enough to make her seek help. Tracey starts contacting the police and asking for help. And here comes the moment that is absolutely pivotal in this story. Tracey did exactly what she was supposed to do. She did what we're all told to do when we're in danger. She contacted the police. Imagine the situation. You're a scared woman with a small child. Your ex-partner is threatening and hurting you. You know you can't wait for the situation to get better on its own because it's only getting worse. So you pick up the phone and call the police or go to the police station in person. You tell them what's going on. Describe the attacks. Repeat the threats you heard. You beg them for help. Tracey did that. She wasn't a passive victim who suffered in silence. She was active, trying to protect herself and her child. She trusted the system. She trusted that if she turned to those who were supposed to protect and serve, she would get the help she needed. The Torrington Police Department was small but fully functional. It had its officers, its protocols, its procedures. It was there for the citizens of the town. It was there to protect them from danger. And Tracey was a citizen of this town who was in clear and present danger, repeatedly reporting to Torrington Police. Here's another key detail I want you to remember. Tracey didn't just go to the police once. She didn't report the incident and then wait to see what happened. She didn't. She went there again and again, repeatedly, persistently, desperately. October 1982 was not just one incident. It was a month of fear, a month of repeated attacks, a month of constant terror. And Tracey responded by contacting the police again and again. Every time Buck showed up, every time he threatened her, every time she felt she was in danger. Do you know what it means to go to the police over and over again? It means overcoming your fear every time. It means telling your story over and over again, which is traumatic in itself. It means hoping that this time they'll take you seriously, that this time they'll help you. And it means facing disappointment when nothing happens. Imagine the frustration. You go to the police and you say, "My ex-partner is threatening me. I'm afraid for my life. I fear for my child's life." And they tell you, what? That they're not going to do anything about it? That it's not their problem? That it's a family matter? In the 1980s, the police approach to domestic violence was very different from today. Domestic violence was seen as a private matter between spouses or partners. The police did not like to interfere. There was an informal, let them sort it out themselves approach. Police officers often told women to go home and try to calm the situation down, or they were advised to just move elsewhere, as if it was that simple. But Tracey didn't give up. Even though her first visit to the police didn't yield the expected results, she returned, and she came back again, and again. She was creating a record, a documentation of what was happening. Perhaps she hoped that if she had enough reports, enough documentation, the police would act. The police systematically ignored her cries for help. And here comes the hardest part of this chapter. The word systematically is key here. It wasn't that one police officer made a mistake. It wasn't that someone didn't answer her call one day by accident. It was systematic. It was repetitive. It was a deliberate disregard for a woman who was screaming for help. When I say systematic, I mean, it was a pattern of behavior. Tracey called. No one came or they were late. Tracey came in person. She was dismissed. Tracey reported in. No action was taken. This happened over and over again, in October 1982 and then in the months that followed. The Torrington Police Department had its priorities, and clearly protecting Tracey Thurman was not one of them. Maybe they thought she was overreacting. Maybe they thought it was just a woman's quarrel. Maybe they just didn't care. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Tracey was left at the mercy of a man who threatened to kill her. You know what that does to a person? When you seek help from those who should help you and they ignore you, you start to doubt yourself. You start to think that maybe you really are overreacting. That maybe it's not as serious as you think. That maybe it's your fault. And at the same time, you feel utterly helpless. Because if the police won't help you, who will? Where do you turn? But Tracey had one thing that kept her fighting. Her son. When you're a mother, you can't afford to give up. You can't just resign yourself to your fate. You have to fight because you're fighting not only for yourself, but for your child. October 1982 was just the beginning. It was the month when things spiraled out of control, when a strained relationship became a life-threatening problem. It was the month when Tracey first realized that the system she trusted might not protect her. And it was the month that began 8 months of terror, 8 months of fear, 8 months of repeatedly ignoring her cries for help. When I think about this period in Tracey's life, I feel a mixture of emotions. I feel anger at the system that failed her. I feel sadness that she had to go through this ordeal. But I also feel respect for her courage. Because even when she was ignored, even when no one seemed to care about her safety, she didn't give up. She kept fighting. She continued to seek help. October 1982 was the month that changed Tracey's life forever. It was the month that set her on a path that would almost end in her death, but ultimately led to a change in the entire system. It was the month that one woman in Connecticut decided she wasn't going to suffer in silence, that she was going to fight, even though she seemed to be in this alone. And this fight, which began in October 1982, was just about to begin. November of the year 1982 brought an event that was to make it clear just how serious the situation surrounding Tracey really was. It was a moment that was to be a turning point, an incident that was to open the eyes of all involved. It was a moment when the violence took place not behind closed doors but out in the open, in public, in front of witnesses, and most importantly, in front of the police. Charles assaults Tracey as she sits in the car. Tracey was sitting in her car. Maybe she was just leaving a shopping trip, maybe she was going somewhere to pick up her son, maybe she just needed a moment of privacy in her own vehicle. For many people, a car is a safe space. You're inside, you can lock the doors, you have control over who gets in. It's your private territory on wheels. But for Tracey, even the car didn't become a safe place. Buck found her. I'm not sure if he followed her, if he knew where she was, or if he just met her by accident. But the result was the same. He showed up where Tracey was and decided to act. Tracey was inside the car. Her door was closed. Maybe she was hoping that if she stayed inside, she'd be safe. Maybe she thought Buck wouldn't be so bold as to attack her in a public place where other people could see him. But Buck was beyond rational thought. His rage, his need for control, his desire to hurt Tracey, all of it overrode any common sense. Buck started acting aggressive. He yelled at Tracey through the closed window. He banged on the windows. He was shaking the car. I'm trying to imagine the terror. You're sitting in your car, which should be your safe space, and someone is furiously attacking you from outside. You hear screaming. You feel the car shaking. You see a distorted face full of rage just outside your window. Your heart is pounding. Your hands are shaking. Do you have the keys in the ignition? Can you quickly start the engine and drive away? Or are you trapped? The police officer is watching but not intervening. And now comes the most shocking part of the whole incident. There was a police officer on the scene. I read that right and you heard it right. The police officer was right there, saw what was going on, and witnessed Buck assaulting Tracey. How did the officer get there? Maybe he just happened to be driving by. Maybe someone called the police when they saw the situation unfold. Maybe he was there for another reason entirely. But he was there, in uniform, with a badge, with a responsibility to protect the citizens. And what did he do? Nothing. He stood by. He stood there and watched the situation unfold. He didn't try to stop Buck. He didn't try to come between him and Tracey. He didn't try to calm the situation. He just stood there. I'm trying to understand what was going through his head. He thought it was just a marital spat? Did he think he had no right to interfere in family matters? Or did he just not care? He saw the woman in the car who was clearly scared and the man outside who was clearly aggressive and decided to take no action. Imagine how Tracey must have felt. She saw a police officer. Maybe she was screaming at him for help. Maybe she waved at him. Maybe she was pleading with him with her eyes for him to intervene, and he just stood there. Her hope that she would finally get help, that someone would finally intervene, was dashed right before her eyes. That's betrayal on a whole other level. When a partner betrays you, it's horrible. But when you are betrayed by the system that is supposed to serve and protect you, when you are betrayed by the person in uniform you trusted to help you, that is something that shakes your faith in everything. Charles smashes the windshield with his fist while Tracey is inside. The situation has escalated. Buck wasn't satisfied with just screaming and banging on the car. His anger was growing and he needed to find a way to get to Tracey. So he did something that required tremendous strength and even more rage. He attacked the car itself. Buck's fist came up and slammed into the windshield with full force. Once, twice, again and again. The glass is designed to withstand the impact, to protect the people inside. But nothing is unbreakable, especially when someone attacks it with such ferocity. Imagine the sound. A fist hitting the glass, a crack starting to spread across your field of vision. Another blow, another crack. The glass begins to crumble, begins to loosen. And you are inside with no escape, watching your last barrier of protection crumble before your eyes. Tracey must have been in shock. She must have been paralyzed with fear. She could see the hands of the man she had a child with pushing through the windshield of her car with brutal force. She saw his face distorted with rage. She heard his screams. And she knew that if he got inside, there was nothing to stop him. And what was the police officer doing? Still nothing. He stood there and watched the man commit an obvious crime, damaging someone else's property, assault, threats. He watched as the woman in the car trembled in fear, and he didn't lift a finger. Buck's hands must have been damaged. Breaking a windshield with your fist is not something you can do without consequences. Knuckles must have bled, skin must have cracked. But that didn't stop him. The pain was nothing compared to his need to get to Tracey, to show her that there was no escape from him, that he could get her any time, anywhere. The subsequent arrest and court proceedings, eventually, and I don't know exactly what the trigger was, Buck was arrested. Perhaps the situation had gone so far that even the indifferent police officer could no longer stand by. Maybe another patrol arrived. Maybe someone else called the police and reported the attack. But in the end, Buck ended up in handcuffs. Arrest is the first step. It's the moment when the perpetrator loses his freedom, when he's taken to the station, when he's officially charged with a crime. It must have been a relief for Tracey, albeit temporary. I thought that after the trial there would finally be peace, that when the court passed sentence, when the conditions were set, the system would finally start to work. But the reality was very different. What followed was perhaps even worse than what had preceded it, because Tracey had reason to believe she was protected. She had the paperwork, she had the court order, and yet she remained defenseless. Charles immediately violates the court order. The court made it clear. Buck was to stay away from Tracey. He was on probation. He had clear boundaries that he couldn't cross. But you know what happened right after that? He ignored it. Completely. It's like the judge's words didn't mean anything at all, like the paper was just a worthless piece of text that said nothing. Buck was showing up where Tracey was. He followed her. He was showing up outside the house where she lived, waiting for her at the places she went. It wasn't a random encounter once in a while. It was a systematic, repeated, deliberate violation of a court order. Day after day after day. Week after week after week. Imagine the situation from Tracey's point of view. You've got a piece of paper from the court telling you to leave the man alone. You believe that if he has a court order, he has to follow it, or he'll be punished. You feel, maybe for the first time in a long time, a little hope, a little security. And then you open the door and there he is. Or you look out the window and you see him standing across the street watching you. Or you go shopping and he suddenly appears next to you. That sense of security, that paper from the courthouse, it all crumbles to dust. You realize that the court order is just paper, that it has no real power unless it's enforced. And you begin to understand that no one will enforce it. Buck wasn't just passively present. He wasn't just threatening his presence. He was talking to Tracey. He was yelling at her. He threatened her. He said things to her that kept her in constant fear. Maybe he was telling her that he was going to get her. Maybe he told her he didn't give a shit about the court paper. Maybe he was telling her exactly what he'd do to her when he caught her alone. Tracey repeatedly reports violations of her parole. And Tracey? She did exactly what she was supposed to do. Every time Buck violated a court order, she reported it. She picked up the phone and called the police. Or she went to the station herself. She told them, "Buck Thurman harassed me again today. He violated a court order. I need you to intervene." It wasn't one complaint. It wasn't two complaints. It was dozens of complaints. Imagine having to go to the police again and again and report the same person for the same offense. Imagine having to explain over and over again that you are being threatened, that you are in danger, that you need help. Every such visit to the police takes courage. It requires energy that you often do not have as a victim of domestic violence. It requires overcoming fear, overcoming the feeling that nothing will help anyway. But Tracey did. Over and over again. Because she believed that if she persisted enough, if she had enough documentation, the police would take action. She kept her own records. She wrote down when and where Buck showed up, what he said, what he did. She was creating her own evidence because she knew she might need to prove that this wasn't a one-time thing, that this was a pattern of behavior. She was trying to be responsible, trying to do everything right. You know what the most tragic part of this is? That Tracey did more work documenting Buck's law-breaking than the police themselves. She kept more accurate records. She was the one who tracked the pattern of behavior. She was the one who tried to get the system to act. The police are refusing to arrest Charles. And here comes the crux of the problem. The police knew Buck was violating a court order. They had a report from Tracey. They had documentation. They knew there was a court order that Buck was ignoring. And what did they do? They did nothing. Absolutely nothing. They refused to arrest him. When Tracey called and said, "Buck's here, he's violating a court order, come arrest him," the police either didn't come at all or were late until Buck was gone. And even if they arrived on time and Buck was there, they found no reason to arrest him. How is that possible? How is it possible that someone has a court order that clearly says, "Stay away from this person," and when they violate it, the police say, "We can't do anything"? How does that make sense? The answer is simple. It doesn't. It's not logical, it's not fair, it's not in accordance with the law. But that was the reality for Tracey and for thousands of other women at the time. Domestic violence was simply not considered a priority. Violating a court order in a domestic violence case was not considered serious enough to warrant arrest. If Buck had violated a court order by approaching someone to whom he was not related, the police might have acted differently. If it was stalking someone he was not related to, maybe they would have taken it more seriously. But because it was his wife, even though they were no longer living together, because it was a family matter, the police considered it less important. Officers might have said things like, "Figure it out on your own." Or, "He didn't do anything to you, he was just standing there." Or, "We can't arrest him just because he's threatening you." They found 1,000 reasons not to intervene, but not one reason why they should. May 1983. Tracey gets a restraining order. Several months pass. Months of fear, months of repeated violations, months of being ignored by the police. And Tracey decided to try a different approach. In May 1983, she went to court again and applied for a formal protection order, a restraining order. That's a more powerful tool than just the probation from the previous conviction. A protective order is specifically designed to protect victims of domestic violence or stalking. It is a legal document that clearly states that the person cannot approach the victim, cannot contact the victim, cannot be in the victim's place. Tracey had to go to court. She had to explain the situation to the judge. She had to present evidence that she was in danger. She had to relive all the incidents, relive all the threats. But she did it, because she hoped that this would be the tool that would finally get the police to act. The judge heard her story. He saw the documentation. He saw a pattern of behavior, and he decided to issue her a protective order. It was an official acknowledgement that Tracey was in danger, that she needed protection from Buck. Tracey left the courtroom with that paper in her hand. Maybe she was relieved. Maybe she was thinking, now, finally, now that I have an official protection order, the police will have to step in if Buck violates it. Maybe for the first time in a long time she allowed herself to hope. Even so, the police are not providing adequate protection, but nothing has changed. Absolutely nothing. Buck continued to violate the warrant and the police continued to do nothing. The protective order was as worthless as the previous court conditions because no one was enforcing it. Buck knew they wouldn't take him away. He learned that he could do whatever he wanted and nothing would happen to him. He could show up at Tracey's house and the police wouldn't come. He could threaten her and the police wouldn't arrest him. He could ignore every court order, every condition, every regulation because he knew there were no real consequences. And Tracey? Tracey lived in constant fear, with a piece of paper that was supposed to mean protection, but was really just a reminder of how much the system had failed her. She had all the right documents. She took all the right steps. She followed all the right procedures. And yet she was alone. The police in Torrington had failed on every level. Individual officers who refused to respond to calls failed. The leadership that failed to create procedures for dealing with domestic violence failed. The entire system failed, which considered the life and safety of the woman less important than the convenience of officers who did not want to deal with family squabbles. A total of 8 months of ignoring her cries for help. 8 months. 240 days. Thousands of hours lived in fear. That's how long Tracey begged for help and was ignored. From October 1982 to June 1983. 8 months is a long time. It's enough time for a baby to be born. It's enough time to graduate from school. It's enough time to turn autumn into winter, winter into spring, and spring into summer. And all the while, Tracey lived with the knowledge that Buck could come at any time and no one would protect her. 8 months of repeated calls to the police. 8 months of visits to the police station. 8 months of documenting, reporting, pleading for help. 8 months of hoping that maybe this time, maybe today, the police will finally intervene, and 8 months of disappointment. Imagine how it changed Tracey. How it changed her view of the world, her trust in the system, her belief that there is justice. Every day she called and no one came was another blow to her psyche. Every day Buck violated an order and nothing happened was another confirmation that she was alone. And you know what's maybe the worst part? That Tracey wasn't the only one. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of women in the same situation across the United States. Women who had court orders, who called the police, who begged for help, and were ignored. Tracey was not the exception. She was the rule. Those 8 months were 8 months of systemic failure. It was 8 months of evidence that something was deeply wrong with how society approaches domestic violence. And it was 8 months that led to what was to come. An event so horrific that it could no longer be ignored. June 10th, 1983. Friday. A normal summer day in Connecticut. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, people were planning their weekend. For most Torrington residents, it was a day like any other. But for Tracey, it was the day that would change everything. The day that would almost end her life, and the day that would ultimately change the entire legal system. Charles shows up at the house on the morning of June 10th. Tracey was at the house at number 5 Danner Street, where she was living at the time. It wasn't her own house. She was staying with friends or relatives, as is often the case when you're running away from an abusive partner. She was trying to build some stability for herself and her young son in this temporary refuge. And then Buck showed up. He was just suddenly there. Maybe he'd been waiting there for a while. Maybe he'd just arrived. But there he was, outside the house where Tracey lived, The place that should have been her safe space was suddenly no longer safe. We don't know exactly what Buck was doing in the hours or days before. Was he planning this? Thinking about what he was going to do? Or was it a spontaneous decision? Did he take things with him that he used later? These questions may never be fully answered, but we do know that on the morning of June 10th he decided to come to Tracey. His presence there was itself a violation of the protective order. Just by standing there, he was already committing a crime. But as we've seen in previous months, that alone never led to his arrest. Buck demands to meet with Tracey. Buck wasn't just quietly present. He started calling Tracey. He yelled that he wanted to meet her, that he needed to talk to her, that she had a right to see her son. He used every argument, every manipulation possible to get her to come out. Maybe he sounded urgent. Maybe he sounded angry. Maybe he alternated anger with pleading, as manipulative people often do. Please, we need to talk. And then, come out, or... This cat and mouse game, this psychological torture. Tracey was inside the house. She heard his voice. She heard his demands. And she knew what she had to do. She knew she couldn't come out. She knew her only chance of safety was to stay inside and call the police, which is exactly what she did. Tracey stays inside and calls the police. Tracey picked up the phone. She dialed the Torrington police number. When someone answered, she told them what was going on. Buck Thurman is here. He's outside the house. He's threatening me. He's violating a protective order. I need you to come. It wasn't a hysterical call. Tracey had experience calling the police. She knew how to talk, what to say. She was clear. She was specific. She gave them the address. She told them who was there. Told them about the protective order. She did everything she was supposed to do. She waited on the phone, inside the house, safe behind a locked door. Her son was with her. She had to reassure him while she was terrified. She had to explain to him why they had to stay quiet, why they couldn't go outside, why Daddy was screaming outside. Imagine the situation. You're trapped in your own temporary home. There's a man outside threatening to kill you. You called the police and now you're just waiting. You look at the clock. He's listening for sirens. You pray they come quickly before the situation escalates. He's asking for Charles to be arrested for violating the terms. Tracey wasn't just a passive distress speaker. When she called the police, she was very specific about what she needed. She didn't just say, please come. She said, I need you to arrest Buck Thurman for violating a protective order. That's an important detail. Tracey knew what her rights were. She knew Buck was breaking the law. She knew the police had the authority and the duty to arrest him. And she communicated that clearly. It wasn't a request for help in a vague sense. It was a specific request for specific action. She told them she had a protective order. She may have told them the case number or the date it was issued. She was trying to provide any information that might expedite their response. She was doing the work for them to make it easier for them to intervene. And what did they tell her on the other end of the line? Did they promise to come? Did they say they'd send a patrol? Or did they shoo her away, as they'd done so many times before? We don't know exactly what their response was, but we know what followed. 15 minutes of waiting. No police. The clock was ticking. The minutes ticked by. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and no police. 15 minutes may not sound like a long time. When you're waiting for a bus, when you're cooking dinner, when you're watching a TV show, 15 minutes goes by fast. But when you're in danger, when you're waiting for help, when you know there's someone out there who wants to hurt you, 15 minutes is an eternity. Every minute must have been agonizing. Tracey might have kept peeking through the window, watching Buck outside, watching the street for a police car. Maybe she picked up the phone again to verify that the call had gone through, that it wasn't a dream or a nightmare. Buck was still out there. His demeanor may have changed as time passed. Maybe he was getting angrier and angrier that Tracey wasn't coming out. Maybe he was realizing the police had been called and deciding what to do. Leave? Or would he stay and see things through? 15 minutes without the police. 15 minutes of a woman with a small child waiting for the protection the system promised her. 15 minutes of nothing happening while the situation could spiral out of control at any second. Where were the police? Why didn't they come? Torrington's not a big town. The distances aren't that long. 15 minutes is more than enough time for a patrol to arrive on the scene. So what happened? They didn't take the call seriously? Did they have more important things to do? Or did they simply ignore another call from Tracey Thurman because they were tired of her repeated requests for help? Tracey comes out to talk to him and protect her son. And then Tracey made a decision. A decision that may have saved her son's life, but almost cost her own. She decided to come out. Why? Why would a woman who knew how dangerous Buck was, who had tried to stay safe inside all this time, suddenly come out? The answer is, in the last words of this paragraph, to protect her son. Maybe Buck started threatening to break into the house. Maybe he said he'd break a window or break down a door. Maybe he started talking about marrying his son. And Tracey, like any mother who would do anything to protect her child, decided she'd rather go out and confront him herself than risk Buck breaking in where her little boy was. Or maybe Buck changed his tactics. Maybe he started sounding calmer, more reasonable. Maybe he said, "Please, I just want to talk. Just for a few minutes. I'm not going to hurt you. We just need to talk about something." And Tracey, exhausted from waiting 15 minutes for the police to arrive, may have believed that if she just talked to him quickly he would leave and leave her alone. Or maybe she just couldn't take the uncertainty any longer. She couldn't continue to stand outside the door and listen to his voice, his threats or pleas. She couldn't keep waiting for the police, who obviously wouldn't arrive in time. She decided to take the situation into her own hands. The door opened. Tracey walked out. It was a sunny June morning. The neighbors were outside. They could see what was going on. Tracey stood outside the house facing Buck. Maybe she hoped the presence of the neighbors would keep him away. Maybe she hoped that talking to him would calm him down and he would leave. Maybe she hoped the police would arrive any second and intervene before anything serious happened. But Buck wasn't planning on just talking. Buck wasn't planning to just calm down and leave. Buck was planning something else entirely. And Tracey, who had come out in good faith to protect her child and resolve the situation, had become the target of something no one should have experienced. The moment Tracey walked out the door was the moment her fate was sealed. It was the moment when all those months of being ignored, all those unanswered calls, all those unenforced protective orders, it all culminated into something unimaginable. And the police were still nowhere to be seen. I must warn you that this part of the story is extremely heavy and contains descriptions of brutal violence. If you feel it might traumatize you, you can skip this part. But at the same time, it's important to realize how horrific it was, because only then can we understand why this case was so crucial and why it led to changes in the whole system. Charles brutally stabs Tracey with a knife. Buck was carrying a knife. We don't know exactly when he took it, if he kept it hidden the whole time or if he went to his car to get it. But the moment Tracey showed up outside, he had a gun in his hand. And he intended to use it. It happened fast. Buck lunged at Tracey. It wasn't an argument that was escalating. It wasn't a situation where she had a chance to run or defend herself. It was an immediate, brutal attack by a man who was much stronger than her and who had a gun. The knife penetrated her body. Again and again. Buck stabbed with such ferocity, such hatred, that it wasn't just about inflicting pain or injury. It was about destroying. It was about killing. Tracey screamed. The neighbors heard it. Some ran outside when they heard the horrible sounds, the screams of a woman being attacked, the sounds of a struggle, the sounds of something terrible happening right outside their homes. Imagine the horror. You're outside on a sunny morning and suddenly you see a woman being brutally stabbed with a knife right before your eyes. You see blood. You hear her scream. You see her trying to defend herself, trying to cover herself, trying to escape. And the attacker doesn't stop. He raises his knife hand and stabs again and again. 13 stab wounds to the chest, neck, and throat. 13. 13 knife wounds. It's not a number I can erase from my mind. 13 times Buck plunged a knife into the body of the woman he had a child with. 13 times the blade penetrated her flesh, her organs, her life. The wounds were not accidental. They weren't superficial scratches. Buck was targeting the most vulnerable, deadliest parts of the body. The chest, where the heart and lungs are. The neck, where the major arteries are. The throat, where the windpipe is, which you need to breathe. Any wound could be fatal. Every wound was a deliberate attempted murder. Buck wasn't stabbed at random in a fit of rage. He stabbed systematically, aiming for the places where he knew he would cause the most damage, where he would cause death. Chest. A stab to the chest can damage the heart, can cause lung collapse, can lead to massive internal bleeding. When the blade is stabbed into the chest, it pierces the skin, then the muscles, then the ribs or the space between them, and then reaches the organs inside. The pain is unimaginable. The neck. This area contains the carotid arteries, the main arteries that supply blood to the brain. A stab to the neck can cause massive bleeding in seconds. It can also damage the spinal cord, leading to immediate paralysis. It's one of the most dangerous areas of the body for stings. The throat. This is where the trachea is, which carries air to the lungs. Damage to the throat can cause the victim to be unable to breathe. It can also cause blood to flow into the airway, leading to suffocation by the victim's own blood. 13 wounds in these areas. Imagine the physical pain. Imagine the horror of knowing you're dying, of feeling the life drain out of you with every blow, with every stab. Tracey is lying on the ground, bleeding and dying. Tracey fell. Her body couldn't take the attack anymore. She fell to the ground in front of the house on Danner Street where she lived. She was lying there in a pool of her own blood, which was spreading rapidly on the pavement. The bleeding from the 13 stab wounds was massive. The blood flowed from her body at a rate that was alarming. When you have that many wounds in critical places, the body just can't keep the blood in. Blood pressure drops, organs stop getting oxygen, the body starts to burn out. Tracey was conscious. That may be the worst part of the whole situation. She wasn't unconscious. She wasn't losing touch with reality. She knew what was going on. She felt the pain. She saw her own blood. She knew she was dying. Maybe she was thinking of her son. Maybe she was praying for someone to save her. Maybe she cried out for help, though her voice was weak, though only hoarse sounds came from her throat, which was wounded. Her body lay on the hard concrete. The sun was shining. It was a beautiful June day, a day that should have been full of life, and she lay there feeling the life leaving her. Neighbors gathered around her, terrified, shocked, not knowing what to do. Someone might have tried to stop the bleeding. Maybe someone pressed a towel or a piece of clothing to the wound. But with 13 wounds to the chest, neck and throat, there's not much you can do without professional medical help. She needed an ambulance, she needed a doctor, she needed surgery, and she needed it all now. 25 minutes after the first call, the first officer finally arrives. 25 minutes. 25 minutes passed from the moment Tracey picked up the phone and called the police to the moment the first officer finally showed up. 25 minutes. Do you know how much 25 minutes can cost? It could cost a life. And in Tracey's case, it almost cost. When Officer Frederick Petrovitz Jr. finally arrived, the situation was dire. He found the woman lying in a huge pool of blood, 13 stab wounds, barely conscious. He found a scene that looked like something out of a horror movie. What did he think when he saw it? Did he feel remorse? Did he realize that if he had arrived sooner, if someone had arrived in those first 15 minutes, all of this could have been prevented? Or did he just go into do-my-job mode and start dealing with the situation that was in front of him? 25 minutes is an unacceptably long time. In cases of domestic violence where the attacker is on the scene and the victim is in immediate danger, the response should be immediate. All available units should be deployed. It should be considered the #1 priority. But it wasn't. Tracey had to wait 25 minutes. 25 minutes in which she was attacked, stabbed, and lay dying on the ground. A policeman sees Charles putting down a bloody knife, and you know what's maybe the most shocking thing about the whole situation? When Officer Petrovitz arrived, Buck was still there. This wasn't a case where the attacker got away and the police had to start a manhunt. No. Buck was there, at the scene, right in front of the officer. And what was he doing? Putting the knife down. The bloody knife he just used to stab Tracey 13 times. Petrovitz saw it. He saw a man with a bloody knife. He saw a woman lying in a pool of blood. The connection was clear and undeniable. The knife was covered in blood. Buck's hands were probably bloody too. His clothes may have been spattered with blood. All the evidence of what he had just done was right in front of the officer's eyes. In a normal situation, when a police officer arrives on the scene and sees someone with a bloody weapon and a victim lying in blood, the immediate reaction should be to arrest the assailant. It should be an automatic response: secure the suspect, prevent further violence, protect the victim. But none of that happened. It didn't. Petrovitz saw Buck with the knife and did nothing. He just watched. Maybe he was shocked by what he saw. Maybe he didn't know how to react to such a brutal scene. Or maybe, and this is the darkest possibility, he simply didn't consider the domestic violence serious enough to take immediate action. Buck put the knife down. Easy. As if he'd just put down his garden tools after working in the yard. It wasn't an act of surrender. It wasn't an act of contrition. It was simply the act of a man who had done what he wanted to do, and now he was waiting to see what would happen next. And Tracey? Tracey was still on the ground. She was still bleeding. She was still dying. And now there was finally a police officer, a man who had the power and authority to protect her, to get her help, to arrest her attacker. Finally, there was the help she'd been waiting for, begging for. But as we will see in the next section, the presence of a police officer does not mean the end of the horror. In fact, what followed was perhaps even more shocking than the attack itself, because the attack was carried out by a violent man who had lost control. But what followed was carried out by people who were supposed to protect and serve, people in uniform, people who were trusted by society to do the right thing, and they didn't. Just when you think this story couldn't get any worse, here comes this part. The part that made me pause several times and wonder if I had read it right. Because what happened after the first police officer arrived is something that is hard to comprehend. It's behavior that goes against every instinct, every idea of what a police officer should do. The officer watches as Charles kicks Tracey in the head. Officer Petrovitz was standing there. He was in uniform. He had a gun. He had the authority. He had the ability to intervene. And Buck, instead of calming down or surrendering, continued his assault. He walked over to Tracey, who was lying defenseless on the ground, bleeding and dying, and kicked her in the head. He kicked her. In the head. A woman who had already been stabbed 13 times, who had lost a huge amount of blood, who was barely holding on to consciousness. And he did it right in front of a police officer. A kick to the head isn't just another attack. The head is the most vulnerable part of the human body. The brain, which is inside the skull, can be seriously damaged by even a relatively small impact. And Buck didn't kick gently. He kicked with full force, with all his weight, with all his fury. Tracey must have felt the impact. Even though she was in shock, even though she was on the verge of consciousness, you just feel a blow like that to the head. The pain must have been overwhelming. Her already traumatized body was subjected to another wave of agony, and what did Petrovitz do? He stood there. He watched. He didn't run to stop Buck. He didn't pull a gun and order him to stop. He didn't yell, "Stop! Police!" He didn't put himself between Buck and Tracey. He simply stood by and watched more violence unfold right before his eyes. I'm trying to understand that mentality, trying to find some explanation that made sense. Was he paralyzed with shock? Was he scared? Didn't know what to do? But those aren't excusable reasons. He's a cop. He's trained for just such situations. His job is to intervene when someone is attacking another person. Buck runs into the house and comes back with their young son. And then Buck did something even worse. He ran away from Tracey and ran into the house. Into the house where their young son was. A boy who was barely 3 years old at the time, who must have already been terrified by the sounds and screams, who may have seen some of what was going on outside. Buck ran inside and returned a moment later. And in his arms, he carried his child. Little Charles Jr. The little boy who had unwittingly become part of this nightmare. What was Buck up to? Was he going to use the baby as a shield? Was he going to hurt the child? Did he want the child to see what he did to his mother? These questions are frightening, but we must ask them because Buck's behavior was unpredictable and dangerous. Petrovitz saw Buck run into the house. He had a chance to stop him at that moment, a chance to restrain him before he got to the child. But he didn't. He let him go. He let the violent assailant, who had just stabbed a woman 13 times and kicked her in the head, enter the house where the defenseless little child was. And when Buck returned with the child, Petrovitz still wasn't standing. He still didn't use force to stop the situation. He just stood by. He's throwing the baby at the wounded mother. And then Buck did something completely unimaginable. He took his own child, a little boy, and threw him. He threw it at Tracey, his badly injured, dying mother. Imagine the horror. You're a small child, picked up by your father, and then suddenly you're in the air, falling, and you land on your mother who's lying in a pool of blood. Imagine the fear, the confusion, the absolute horror of that moment. It must have been traumatic beyond words for little Charles. At the age of 3, you don't have the ability to understand what's going on, but you certainly feel it. You feel the fear, you feel the pain, you feel the chaos. And these memories, even if they are repressed, stay with you for life. And for Tracey, lying there, dying, and suddenly feeling the weight of your child hitting your stabbed body? The pain of the impact on the wounds must have been excruciating. But even worse must have been the emotional pain, seeing your child used as a weapon, as an instrument of further violence. Buck threw his own child. That is not the act of a rational man. That's not the act of a loving father. This is the act of someone who has completely lost his humanity, who is willing to use anyone and anything to inflict pain. And Petrovitz? He was still standing there. He saw a man throw a small child at a badly wounded woman, and he did nothing. He kicks Tracey in the head for the second time, as if all that wasn't enough, as if the horror already inflicted wasn't enough. Buck attacked again. He walked over to Tracey, who was now on the ground with her son falling on top of her, and kicked her in the head again. A second time, a second blow to the head, another wave of pain, another risk of serious brain injury, another attempt to kill a woman who was already on the verge of death. 2 kicks to the head. This is not a random act of violence. This is a systematic attempted murder. Buck knew what he was doing. He knew kicking him in the head could kill, and he did it deliberately, repeatedly. The skull may be strong, but it's not indestructible. Repeated kicks to the head can cause skull fractures, can cause brain bleeds, can cause brain swelling. And these are all conditions that can lead to death or permanent damage. Tracey must have felt at that moment that this was the end, that she wasn't going to survive this, that Buck was going to kill her and no one was going to stop him, that a police officer standing there watching wouldn't help her, that she would die right there on the street, in front of the house she lived in front of her young son. And still Petrovitz didn't intervene. 3 more policemen arrive, but they do not intervene. And then the situation became even more absurd. More police units arrived. Not 1 more policeman, but 3. There were now 4 police officers in total. 4 uniformed officers with authority, with weapons, with training. 4 against 1. 4 trained officers against 1 violent civilian. In any rational situation, this should mean an immediate end to the violence. It should mean the immediate arrest of the attacker. It should mean immediately ensuring the victim's safety, but none of that happened. All 4 officers were standing there, 4 pairs of eyes watching what was going on, 4 minds registering the violence, the blood, the dying woman, the terrified child, and none of them intervened. How is that possible? How can 4 people who are paid with public money to protect citizens stand by and watch a woman being brutally attacked? What thought processes were running through their heads? Were they waiting for an order? Were they waiting for the situation to resolve itself? Or was domestic violence simply something they didn't care enough about to risk confrontation? The neighbors saw it. Civilians who gathered around saw 4 police officers standing there doing nothing. They saw Tracey dying. They saw Buck continue the violence. And they must have asked themselves the same question I'm asking. Why isn't anyone doing anything? They're letting Charles go free, and continuing to threaten Buck wasn't handcuffed. He wasn't detained. He wasn't even told he had to stop. He was free to move about the crime scene. He could do whatever he wanted. And the cops just watched. Buck was walking around Tracey. Maybe he was talking to her. Maybe he threatened her. Maybe he was telling her she deserved it. Maybe he claimed that if he couldn't have her, no one could. Typical statements from abusive partners who see their victims as property, not human beings. His behavior was unpredictable. One moment he could appear relatively calm, The next, he could explode into violence again. And the cops took a chance. They risked Buck attacking again. They risked him causing even more damage. What about Tracey? She lay there, watching her attacker move freely around her, possibly threatening her, and seeing 4 police officers doing nothing to protect her. Imagine the helplessness. Imagine the desperation. She called the police. The police came. And yet no one is helping her. Buck could also have endangered the neighbors or his son. He was in such a state of mind that he could have done anything. And the cops let him loose as if he wasn't a threat, as if he hadn't just committed attempted murder right in front of them. Arrested after 40 minutes, only when he attacks the paramedics 40 minutes. 40 minutes had passed between Tracey's first call to the police and the moment Buck was finally arrested. 40 minutes of hell. Meanwhile, the paramedics arrived. People who came to save Tracey, to give her emergency medical attention, to take her to the hospital. They were people with no weapons, no defensive gear, just medical equipment and a desire to help. And Buck attacked them. Maybe he didn't want Tracey to get help. Maybe he wanted her dead. Maybe he was just so out of touch with reality that anyone who came close was a target. To attack the paramedics. That crossed some kind of line even for the officers who'd been watching. Maybe the attack on Tracey was a family matter they didn't want to deal with, but the attack on the paramedics, on the third party, on the people who were just there to help, that finally spurred the cops into action. It was only then, after 40 minutes, after 13 stab wounds, after 2 kicks to the head, after a child was thrown, after all the violence and terror, that the police finally intervened. They finally used force to apprehend Buck. They finally handcuffed him. They finally arrested him. 40 minutes too late. 40 minutes in which they could have intervened at any time, but chose to do nothing. 40 minutes that almost cost Tracey her life. 40 minutes that changed her life and her son's life forever. And you know what's maybe the worst part? That this wasn't just one officer's failure. It wasn't one bad day, one bad decision. It was the systematic failure of 4 different officers, who all independently decided that Tracey Thurman's life was not important enough to risk confronting her violent ex-partner. That's the very definition of systemic failure, and it was that failure that ultimately led to the entire system having to be changed. Tracey survived. That's the first thing I have to say, because after what we just went through, it would be easy to think she couldn't have survived. But she did. She was rushed to the hospital, the doctors fought for her life, and she survived. But at what cost? That's the question we have to ask ourselves now. Tracey will spend 8 months in hospital, 8 months, imagine that. 8 months in a hospital bed, 8 months of the smell of disinfectant, white walls, constant medical procedures, 8 months of separation from normal life, from your child, from everything you know. When Tracey was brought to the hospital on the 10th of June in the year 1983, the doctors had to grapple with the extent of her injuries. It wasn't just about treating her wounds and sending her home. It was about saving a life, about rebuilding what had been destroyed, about trying to return functionality to a body that had been so brutally damaged. The first days and weeks were critical. Tracey was likely in intensive care, hooked up to countless machines, monitors tracking every heartbeat, every breath, infusions delivering fluids, medication, nutrition. She may have been on artificial lung ventilation if the damage to her throat was so severe she couldn't breathe on her own. Surgery. I'm sure there was more than one. Surgeons had to repair the damage caused by each of those wounds. They had to stop the internal bleeding. They had to reconstruct the damaged tissue. Each surgery meant more hours under anesthesia, more risks, more trauma to a body that had already been through more than enough. And pain. Imagine the pain she must have felt. Even with the strongest painkillers, waking up every morning must have been absolute agony. Every movement, every breath, every attempt at something as simple as swallowing had to be a reminder of what had happened. 8 months also meant 8 months of mental anguish. To lie there and think about what had happened, replaying it over and over in my head, asking why. What if? Maybe she was having nightmares. Maybe she was afraid of every male voice, every sudden sound. Maybe she woke up screaming, reliving the attack. And then there was the isolation, 8 months away from the normal world. Her son, where was he? Who was looking after him? Did she see him? How often? And when she did see him, how did she explain why he was in the hospital, why he looked the way he did, why he couldn't hug her because it would hurt too much? Physiotherapy had to start early, even though it was painful. A body that has been in bed for months loses muscle mass, loses strength. She had to learn to move again, even though every movement felt like an injury. She had to fight not only the physical effects of the attack, but also the atrophy caused by lying down for so long. 8 months of watching life go on without you. As the seasons change, summer turns to autumn, autumn to winter. How the world outside continues while you are trapped in a hospital room, struggling just to make it through another day. The financial aspect must have been scary too. American healthcare is not cheap. 8 months of hospitalization, countless surgeries, medications, therapies, all must have cost hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars. Who was paying for it? Did Tracey have insurance? And if so, did it cover everything? Or was there a financial burden added to the physical and psychological suffering? She suffered permanent partial paralysis, and then came the news, which must have been devastating. Tracey would not make a full recovery. The damage was too extensive. Some of the injuries were permanent. She had partial paralysis. Partial paralysis. Imagine your body stops listening. You want to move your arm or your leg and it won't. Or it's only partially, weakly, uncontrollably. That simple tasks you've done all your life without thinking about it are suddenly impossible or extremely difficult. We don't know the exact extent of Tracey's paralysis, but we know it was caused by neck and spinal injuries. When Buck stabbed the neck, he could have damaged nerves or even the spinal cord. And if he kicked her when he threw her to the ground, he could have caused further damage to her spine. The spinal cord is like the body's main wiring harness. It carries signals from the brain to every part of the body. When it's damaged, those signals don't get to where they're supposed to go, and the result is paralysis, the inability to move or feel parts of the body below the site of damage. Partial paralysis means that some functions are preserved, but not all. Perhaps Tracey could move a part of her body, but not with full strength or full control. She may have been able to walk, but with difficulty, perhaps with crutches or a walker. Maybe she had trouble with fine motor skills, buttons on her clothes, writing, holding utensils. For a young woman who had previously been fully functional, this adjustment must have been incredibly difficult. Suddenly you need help with things you used to do on your own. Suddenly you're dependent on others for basic daily tasks. Suddenly your body is not your own. It's a body that has betrayed you, that doesn't function as it should. And then there's the stigma. People are watching. People notice that you move differently. Children point fingers. Adults look away because they don't know how to react. Suddenly you're not just Tracey, you're the woman with a disability, the one with the limp, the one who needs help. Lifelong physical and psychological consequences. But paralysis wasn't the only lasting consequence. Tracey took much more from that fateful day. The physical consequences were extensive and permanent. Scars. 13 stab wounds leave 13 scars. Maybe more if more surgical incisions were needed to repair the damage. Scars on the chest, neck, throat. Scars you see every day when you look in the mirror. Scars that remind you of what happened, even if you'd like to forget. Some scars are just cosmetic. They look different, but they don't affect function. But other scars can cause problems. Scar tissue is not as elastic as normal skin and muscle. It can restrict movement. It can hurt, especially with weather changes. It may itch or be sensitive to touch. Damage to the throat may have affected Tracey's ability to speak or swallow. Her voice may have sounded different from before the attack, maybe hoarser, maybe weaker. She may have had trouble eating certain foods because swallowing was difficult or painful. Nerve damage could have caused chronic pain. Neuropathic pain, the kind of pain that comes from a damaged nervous system, is notoriously difficult to treat. It's a pain that never completely goes away, that follows you every day of your life. And then there are the psychological consequences. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is almost certain after such an experience. Flashbacks, sudden vivid memories of an attack that can come over you at any time. Triggers, things that remind you of that day. Maybe the smell of a certain perfume, maybe the sound of someone's voice, maybe the sight of a knife in the kitchen. Anxiety, the constant fear of it happening again, fear of men in general or of certain types of men, fear of open spaces or conversely of enclosed spaces, depending on what the place of the attack reminds you of. Panic attacks, sudden episodes of intense fear where your heart races, you can't breathe, you feel like you're dying. Depression. How could you not be depressed after what happened? Losing the joy of things you once loved. Feeling hopeless. Thoughts that you'd be better off not surviving. The struggle to find a reason to get up every morning. Trouble sleeping. Nightmares where you relive the attack. Not being able to fall asleep because you're afraid of what might happen when you're vulnerable and asleep. Or conversely, sleeping too much as an escape from a reality that is too painful to face. Trust issues. How can you trust a system that has failed you? How can you trust people when those who were supposed to protect you left you almost dead? How can you trust partners in the future when your ex-partner almost killed you? Charles sentenced to 20 years in prison. Buck was on trial. He was on trial, charged with attempted murder, assault, other crimes, and the court found him guilty. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. 20 years. In the context of the American legal system, that may sound like a long time. But is it enough for attempted murder? 13 stab wounds? For kicking someone in the head? For throwing a small child? For months of terror and threats? For Tracey, the sentence must have been a mixed blessing. On the one hand, Buck was locked up. He couldn't bother her. He couldn't assault her. She was safe, at least for a while. That had to be a relief after months and months of living in fear. But on the other hand, 20 years was not a life sentence. 20 years means that one day he'll come out. One day he'll be free again. And what happens then? Will he still be angry? Will he still consider Tracey his property? Will he want to finish what he started? The trial itself must have been traumatic. Tracey probably had to testify. She had to sit in the courtroom and tell what happened. She had to relive it in front of the judge, the jury, the lawyers, maybe even Buck himself. She had to see his face, hear his voice, be in the same room with the man who tried to kill her. And then there was the defense. Buck's lawyers were doing their job, trying to find reasons why he should get a lighter sentence. Maybe they were blaming Tracey. Maybe they claimed she provoked him. Maybe they were painting a picture of a family squabble that had simply gone too far. All these tactics that secondarily victimize the victim. In fact, he served less than 8 years, and then came the next blow. Buck didn't get 20 years. He got a lot less. In fact, he spent less than 8 years in prison. 8 years. Less time than Tracey spent recovering from what he did to her. Less time than she'll need to deal with the psychological consequences. A fraction of the time that she was given as punishment. A lifetime of torment in her own body. How is that possible? How does someone sentenced to 20 years spend less than 8 in prison? The answer lies in the parole system. In America and in many other countries, prisoners often do not serve their entire sentence. If they behave well in prison, they can be released early. Good behavior. Buck behaved well in prison, so he got his reward. Freedom. While Tracey, who did nothing wrong, who was the victim, got a life sentence of permanent disability and psychological trauma. When Tracey found out Buck was out, how must she have felt? The fear, which may have begun to subside a little, came back with full force. He's out. He's free. He can find her. He can try again. What about protection? Did Tracey get any protection when Buck was released? Was he ordered to stay away from her? And if so, what did that mean, knowing how well the protective orders worked before? Less than 8 years for attempted murder. Less than 8 years for destroying another person's life. This is another systemic failure, more evidence that something is deeply wrong with how society approaches domestic violence and victim protection. Tracey could have just walked away. She could have tried to forget, tried to move on with her injuries and trauma, but she didn't. Instead, she chose to fight. She decided that what had happened to her would not be in vain. She decided to confront the system that had failed her and change it. And here begins one of the most important legal battles in the history of domestic violence in the United States. Tracey files a lawsuit against the Torrington Police Department. It was a bold move, Suing the police is not something that comes easily. The police have power, they have resources, they have lawyers. And for the average citizen, especially someone like Tracey who was recovering from trauma and had limited resources, it was a huge challenge. But Tracey decided she couldn't keep quiet. She couldn't just accept that the system had failed and accept it. She knew that if nothing changed, other women would go through the same horror. More victims of domestic violence would cry out for help and be ignored. More lives will be destroyed or lost. Finding a lawyer willing to take on such a case could not have been easy. To sue a city police department is to take on an institution with deep pockets and political clout. It means facing opposition, criticism, perhaps even threats. How many lawyers would be willing to risk that? But Tracey found legal representation. She found people who believed in her case, who saw the injustice of what had happened, and who were willing to fight alongside her. Together, they began building a case against the Torrington Police Department. Preparing such a lawsuit requires an enormous amount of work. You have to gather evidence. All the police records, all the calls Tracey made, documentation of every incident she reported. You have to get witness statements from neighbors who saw the attacks, from people who heard the threats, maybe even from the officers themselves. And Tracey had to be willing to go through all that suffering again. She had to detail every incident, every call to the police, every threat from Buck, every moment when the police failed. She had to document it all, make it available to lawyers, prepare for it to be discussed in public. Imagine the courage. You're still in the process of recovering physically and mentally. Your body is permanently damaged, you have nightmares, you struggle with depression and anxiety, and you decide to enter a legal battle that will last for years, that will expose you to public scrutiny, that will force you to relive the worst moments of your life over and over again. Argument: violation of constitutional rights. 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause. The legal strategy was brilliant. Tracey and her lawyers didn't just turn to the common law of negligence or failure to perform. They went much further. They argued that the Torrington Police Department violated Tracey's constitutional rights. Specifically, they invoked the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. This amendment, adopted after the American Civil War, contains several key civil rights provisions. One of these is the Equal Protection Clause. What does this clause say? It basically says that a state cannot deny any person within its territory the equal protection of the laws. All citizens are entitled to the same level of protection from the state. You cannot protect one group of people and ignore another group. That was the crux of the argument. Tracey and her attorneys argued that the Torrington Police Department provided different levels of protection to different groups of people. Specifically, they were providing protection to victims of violence from strangers, but they were not providing the same protection to victims of domestic violence. It was a constitutional argument. They didn't just say, the police made a mistake, or the police were negligent. They said, the police systematically discriminated against a certain group of citizens and thereby violated their basic constitutional rights. That was a revolutionary approach. Traditionally, domestic violence was considered a private matter, something beyond the reach of constitutional rights. But Tracey and her lawyers argued that when the state, represented by the police, deliberately provides less protection to a particular group of citizens, it is a constitutional problem. They had to prove several things. First, that there was a pattern of behavior, that it wasn't just a one-time failure, but a systematic practice. Second, that the practice was discriminatory, that it specifically targeted a certain group of people. And third, that this discrimination violated constitutional rights. Evidence of discrimination. Police protected victims of violence from strangers but not from partners, and that's where the hard documentation came in. Tracey and her lawyers had to prove that the police in Torrington actually acted differently in domestic violence cases compared to other violence cases. They started collecting data. They looked at police records from Torrington over a period of time. They analyzed how the police responded to different types of reports of violence. And the pattern they found was clear and disturbing. When someone called the police and said, "A stranger attacked me," or "Someone I don't know is threatening me," The police responded quickly. They arrived on the scene. They made an arrest. She took it seriously. She provided the protection the citizen needed. But when the woman called and said, "My husband assaulted me," or "My ex-partner is threatening me," the response was very different. The police either didn't come at all or arrived late. She refused to arrest the attackers even when they were violating court orders. She told the women to figure it out on their own, or to just leave. This disparity in treatment was systematic. It wasn't just one or two officers who were prejudiced. It was the entire culture of the department, the entire attitude toward domestic violence as something less important, less serious, less worthy of police attention. Tracey wasn't the only one. While preparing the case, the lawyers found other women in Torrington who had similar experiences. Women who had called the police about domestic violence and been ignored. Women who had protection orders that were not enforced. Women who begged for help and didn't get it. These stories created a mosaic of systematic discrimination. They showed that Tracey was not an exception, that this was not just bad luck or coincidence. It was a pattern, a policy, a culture that devalued the lives and safety of women in abusive relationships. The systematic provision of less protection to women abused by husbands or partners' lawyers had to explain to the court why this difference in treatment was discriminatory. They had to show that women in abusive relationships were specifically and systematically deprived of the protection to which they were entitled. The argument went like this. When the police decide that a certain type of violence, domestic violence, is not worthy of the same level of response as other types of violence, they are effectively saying that the lives and safety of victims of domestic violence are less important. And because the vast majority of victims of domestic violence are women, this policy discriminates on the basis of gender. That was the key legal argument. It wasn't just an argument about negligence or poor job performance. It was an argument about systematic discrimination against a protected group: women. The police in Torrington had a clear duty to protect all citizens, but by its actions, or rather inactions, in domestic violence cases, it was effectively saying, if a stranger attacks you, we will protect you. If your spouse attacks you, that's your problem. This approach has had devastating consequences. Women stayed in abusive relationships because they knew the system would not help them. Women were hurt or killed because the police refused to intervene. And attackers were taught that they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. Tracey was living proof of those consequences. She did everything right. She reported the violence. She got court orders. She called the police over and over again, and yet she was nearly killed while 4 police officers stood by. Her case was not an outlier. It was the logical result of a system that systematically refused to protect victims of domestic violence. The court ruled in her favor, and then came the moment. After years of preparation, after countless court hearings, after presenting all the evidence and arguments, the court issued its decision. Tracey won. The court agreed with her reasoning. It ruled that the Torrington Police Department had indeed violated her constitutional rights. It ruled that the systematic failure to protect victims of domestic violence constituted a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. It was a historic decision. It was the first time that a court at this level had recognized that the police could be sued for failing to protect a victim of domestic violence. It was the first time that domestic violence was recognized not as a private matter but as a public safety issue that requires the same level of police response as any other type of violence. In his decision, the judge made it clear that the police cannot provide different levels of protection to different groups of citizens, that domestic violence is as serious as any other violence, that women have a right to protection from the police, regardless of who the attacker is. It must have been extremely satisfying for Tracey. After years of struggle, after all the suffering, finally recognition had come. The court said, "Yes, you have been wronged. Yes, the system has failed. And yes, it was wrong." But it wasn't just a personal win for Tracey. It was a victory for all victims of domestic violence. It was a message to police departments across the country. You can't ignore domestic violence. You can't provide less protection to women in abusive relationships. If you do, you violate their constitutional rights and you can be sued. This decision has opened the door for change. It set a legal precedent that could be used in other cases. It gave victims of domestic violence a tool they could use to force the police to take them seriously. It was the beginning of a new era in the approach to domestic violence in the United States. And it all began with one woman who refused to be silent, who refused to accept that the system that failed her was immutable. Tracey Thurman took her pain, her experience, her suffering, and transformed it into a force for change. That is true courage. That is true heroism. Not just to survive, but to fight. Not just to heal yourself, but to try to change the system so that other people don't have to go through what you went through. And Tracey did it. This isn't just a story about one woman who won a court case. This is the story of how one decision changed the entire legal system, how one ruling created ripples that spread across the United States and affected the lives of thousands, perhaps millions of women. Let's now take a detailed look at what this historic ruling actually meant. The court's landmark decision. When the court handed down its decision in Thurman versus City of Torrington, it was not just another case in a long line of lawsuits. It was a moment that lawyers and domestic violence experts immediately recognized as groundbreaking. What makes a court decision groundbreaking? It's a combination of several factors. First, it must address an issue that has not yet been clearly resolved in the law. Second, it must establish a new legal principle or interpretation that other courts can follow. And third, it must have the potential to affect a broad area of law or social practice. The Tracey decision met all of these criteria. The court confronted a question that has long been ignored. Do police have a duty to protect victims of domestic violence in the same way they protect other citizens? And it answered with a resounding yes. But it was more than a yes or no answer. In its decision, the court explained its reasoning in detail. It analyzed the constitutional principles. It analyzed the evidence of systematic discrimination. It created a legal framework that could be applied to similar cases across the country. The language of the judgment was strong and clear. The judge did not use evasive language or legalese that would weaken the decision. He wrote a decision that was clear in its moral and legal position. What happened to Tracey Thurman was unacceptable. It was a violation of her fundamental rights, and the police must be held accountable. This type of clear, principled decision is rare. Many court decisions are full of technicalities, narrow interpretations, limited applications. But this decision was broad in scope and bold in its moral stance. Police can be sued for failing to protect victims of domestic violence. This was perhaps the most important legal principle established by the ruling. Prior to this case, there was a generally accepted doctrine that the police could not be sued for failure to protect. This doctrine was based on the principle that the police have a general duty to protect the public as a whole, but not specific individuals. In other words, if the police fail to protect a particular person, they cannot be sued for that failure, because their duty is to the community as a whole, not to individuals. This doctrine essentially gave the police immunity. They could ignore calls for help, they could fail to respond to violence, and victims had no legal recourse. It was frustrating, it was unfair, but it was the law. The Tracey ruling did not reject this doctrine entirely, but it did create an important exception. It said, yes, the police usually cannot be sued for failure to protect individuals. But when the police systematically provide different levels of protection to different groups of people when they discriminate, then that is a violation of constitutional rights and the police can be sued. That was a brilliant legal strategy. It did not attack the very doctrine of police immunity that was deeply rooted in American law. Instead, she argued that this immunity could not protect discriminatory conduct. In practical terms, it meant that victims of domestic violence were given a new tool. If they could prove that the police had systematically ignored their cries for help because it was domestic violence, they could sue. They no longer had to just passively accept that the system had failed them. This principle had a tremendous psychological effect on police departments. Suddenly there was risk. The risk of being sued, the risk of financial compensation, the risk of public humiliation. And that risk was a powerful motivator to change behavior. Such a failure could constitute discrimination. The court went further and clearly defined what constitutes discrimination in the context of police protection. It was not just about deliberate animus or overt prejudice. It was about a systematic difference in treatment. The judgment explained that discrimination need not be intentional in the sense that police officers deliberately hate women or victims of domestic violence. Discrimination can also be structural, built into an organization's policies, procedures, and culture. When a police department has an informal policy that domestic violence is a family matter and should not be a priority, that is discrimination. When police officers are trained to avoid intervening in domestic violence because it is complicated or dangerous, that is discrimination. When there is a culture that downplays violence against women by their partners, that is discrimination. The court has also clearly linked this type of discrimination to gender. It said that because the vast majority of victims of domestic violence are women, policies that provide less protection to victims of domestic violence effectively discriminate against women as a group. That was an important connection. It elevated domestic violence from a family issue to a gender issue. It placed it in the broader context of the struggle for women's rights and equality. The judgment also established that this discrimination was not only morally wrong, but constitutionally unacceptable. It is a violation of fundamental rights guaranteed by the United States Constitution. It gave the issue a weight and gravity it did not have before. Original compensation, $2,300,000. And then there was the question of damages. How much is fair compensation for what Tracey had been through? How do you value the years of pain, the permanent disability, the psychological trauma, the loss of quality of life? The court decided on a figure of $2,300,000. That was a huge sum in the 1980s. It was a sum that sent a clear message. This failure had serious consequences, and the city of Torrington will pay for it. This amount was no accident. It was calculated on the basis of several factors. First, compensation for medical costs, 8 months of hospitalization, countless surgeries, ongoing medical care. That alone must have been hundreds of thousands of dollars. Second, compensation for loss of income and future earning capacity. Tracey was a young woman who would have a full working career ahead of her, but her disability limited what work she could do, how much she could earn. The court had to calculate how much money she was likely to lose over her lifetime because of the disability caused by the assault. Third, compensation for pain and suffering. This is the hardest part to quantify because how can you assign a monetary value to physical pain? How do you value the nightmares, the anxiety, the depression? How do you quantify the loss of enjoyment of life? The court attempted to take all of these factors into account and arrived at a figure of $2,300,000. It was an amount that acknowledged the extent of Tracey's suffering while sending a message to other cities and police departments. Ignoring domestic violence can be very expensive. The amount also had symbolic significance. It showed that women's lives and safety have value, that when the system fails and a woman is hurt, there are consequences, that society recognizes that an injustice has been done and will try to correct it, even if money cannot restore health or erase the trauma. After the appeal, the settlement, $1,900,000. But the city of Torrington hasn't given up. It filed an appeal. They wanted to challenge the court's decision, to challenge the amount of compensation. Another legal battle began, another round of court hearings. The appeals process in the American legal system can take years. You have to prepare an appeal brief. The other side has to respond. The appellate court has to review the entire case, hear arguments, issue a decision. It's a grueling process, especially for someone like Tracey, who has been through so many legal battles. The city has argued various points. They may have questioned the extent of their liability. Maybe they argued that the amount of compensation was too high. Maybe they were trying to find technical errors in the original process. But the appeals court essentially upheld the original decision. It agreed that the city of Torrington was liable. It agreed that there was a violation of constitutional rights. The only change it made was a slight reduction in the amount of damages. The final amount was $1,900,000, a reduction of $400,000. It's still a huge amount, still a clear signal, but a little less than the original judgment. Why was the compensation reduced? The Court of Appeals may have had a different view on some aspects of the calculation. It may have considered some costs to be overstated. Perhaps it applied different legal standards for determining the amount of damages. It must have been conflicting for Tracey. On the one hand, she still won. She still got a huge award. The city was still found liable. But on the other hand, after another year of legal battle, after more stress and exhaustion, the amount was reduced. But maybe it was also a pragmatic decision. To continue fighting for the $400,000 would have meant another appeal, another year of waiting, more uncertainty. Accepting the settlement meant it would finally be over. That Tracey could finally close this chapter and move on. $1,900,000. In today's money, that would be the equivalent of a lot more, maybe $4 or $5 million after adjusting for inflation. It's a sum that could have provided Tracey with financial security, paid for her ongoing medical care, provided her with the means to build a new life. But more important than the amount itself was the precedent. It was proof that victims of domestic violence can fight against a system that has failed them and win. That justice is possible, even if it takes years of struggle. That change is possible, even when it seems impossible. The historic verdict in Thurman versus City of Torrington was not just about money. It was about recognition, about accountability, about change. It was about one woman saying no to a system that had failed her and being able to change that system. And that's a legacy that is priceless. Now I come to the part that fascinates me most about this story, because here we see how one woman, one case, one court decision can change an entire system. How a personal tragedy can transform into a catalyst for social change. Let's take a close look at the legacy that the Tracey Thurman case has left, and how it has changed attitudes about domestic violence across the United States. The case of Thurman versus City of Torrington has set a precedent. The American legal system operates under something called stare decisis, the principle of precedent. This means that when a court rules a certain way in one case, other courts should follow that ruling in similar cases. It's a way to ensure consistency and predictability in the law. The case of Thurman versus City of Torrington became just such a precedent. It became a point of reference that other victims of domestic violence could refer to when they sued their local police departments. It became a legal tool that attorneys could use to argue that their clients deserved protection. What did this mean in practice? When a woman in any city in the United States faced a similar situation, repeatedly calling the police, having protection orders that were not enforced, and ultimately being injured, she could point to the Thurman case and say, "Look, the court has already ruled that this is a violation of constitutional rights. The same situation happened to me." Lawyers began citing the Thurman case in their filings. Judges referred to it in their decisions. It became part of legal literature, law textbooks, law school lectures. Law students learned about it as a key case in the field of domestic violence and police accountability. But precedent is not just about the fact that there is a decision that you can appeal. It's also about creating pressure for change. When police departments across the country saw what happened in Torrington, that the city had to pay nearly $2 million, they began to realize that ignoring domestic violence has consequences. Police chiefs began to change policies. City councils began allocating more resources to address domestic violence. Insurance companies that insured cities against lawsuits began requiring police departments to have adequate procedures for dealing with domestic violence. All of these changes were driven by the fear of another Thurman lawsuit. Changes in police approaches to domestic violence across the U.S. Prior to the Thurman case, there was a general attitude towards domestic violence that can be summed up as, "It's a family matter, we should stay out of it." Officers were often instructed to try to calm the situation and leave, but not to make arrests. There was even a term for what the police did, crisis intervention or crisis intervention. The idea was that the police would come in, separate the parties involved, maybe take somebody out of the house for a while to calm everybody down. But then, everyone leaves and the situation remains the same. After the Thurman case, that approach began to change dramatically. Police departments across the country began to rethink their policies on domestic violence. They began to understand that domestic violence is not just a family fight. It is a crime that requires the same response as any other violence. Some states began to pass new laws that specifically addressed how police should respond to domestic violence. These laws often required police to take domestic violence seriously, to document incidents, and to provide information to victims about their rights and available resources. Training for police officers has also changed. Instead of minimal training on dealing with domestic violence, police academies began to include extensive modules on the dynamics of domestic violence, how to recognize warning signs, how to intervene safely, and how to protect victims. Emphasis was also placed on understanding the psychology of domestic violence. Officers were taught that domestic violence usually escalates over time, that the most dangerous time for a victim is often when they are trying to leave, that protection orders are papers that must be actively enforced, not just issued. The introduction of mandatory arrest policies. This was perhaps the most concrete and significant change to come out of the Thurman case. Many states and cities have begun to adopt what are called mandatory arrest policies. What does that mean? Basically, it means that when police arrive at a domestic violence scene and there is evidence that an assault has occurred, visible injuries, confessions, witnesses, the officer must make an arrest. It's not at his discretion. It's not optional. It's a duty. Prior to these policies, police officers had considerable discretion. They could have decided that an arrest was not necessary, that the situation could be handled differently, that the victim didn't seem that serious. And as we saw in the Tracey case, this discretion often led to the attackers not being arrested and the violence continuing. Mandatory arrest policies have eliminated this discretion. They said, if violence has occurred, the attacker must be arrested. Period. No exceptions, no excuses, no consideration of whether it's just a family squabble. These policies had several important effects. First, they sent a clear message to the attackers. If you use violence, you will be arrested. This had a deterrent effect. Some potential attackers may have changed their minds about using violence because they knew the consequences would be immediate. Second, they provided victims with immediate relief. The attacker was removed from the house, at least temporarily. This gave the victim time to breathe, perhaps seek help, perhaps plan next steps. Third, it sent a signal to the victims that the system was taking them seriously, that their safety is a priority, that if they call for help, the police will intervene. This may have encouraged more victims to report violence because they knew their calls would not be ignored. Of course, these policies were not without controversy. Some critics argued that mandatory arrests could sometimes be counterproductive, for example, in situations where both parties were violent and it was unclear who the primary assailant was. Others worried that it might discourage victims from calling the police if they didn't want their partner arrested. But overall, mandatory arrest policies were seen as a significant improvement over the previous system, where arrests were rare and assailants could continue their violence without consequence. The emergence of specialized domestic violence units. With the growing recognition that domestic violence requires a specialized approach, police departments began to create specialized units dedicated solely to addressing domestic violence. These units had officers who were specially trained in the dynamics of domestic violence. They understood the behavioral patterns of the attackers. They knew how to talk to victims in a way that was trauma-sensitive. They knew the resources available and could connect victims to shelters, legal help, counseling. Specialized units also often included not only police officers but social workers, psychologists, lawyers. It was a multidisciplinary approach that recognized that domestic violence is not just a criminal justice issue. It is a complex problem that requires different types of intervention. These units also often conducted follow-up visits to victims. They were not content with just responding to an acute incident. They went back, checked on the victim, offered additional support, and made sure that protection orders were being followed. Some police departments have also begun to use technology to better track domestic violence cases. They were creating databases that recorded all incidents, all calls, all protection orders. This helped identify patterns in high-risk situations where serious violence or homicide could occur. Better training of police officers. Training became a key part of the change in the police approach to domestic violence. Police academies have begun to devote much more time and resources to preparing new officers to deal with these situations. Training covered a wide range of topics. Officers learned about the cycle of violence, how domestic violence typically occurs in patterns of tension, explosion, and reconciliation. They were taught to recognize the warning signs of escalating violence. They learned that economic control, isolation from family and friends, jealousy, and possessiveness are all indicators of a potentially deadly situation. There was a strong emphasis on safety, how to safely approach domestic violence situations, which can be very dangerous for police officers, but also how to ensure the safety of the victim during and after the intervention. Officers were also taught about trauma and its effects. They learned why victims sometimes defend their attackers or refuse to cooperate with police. They learned that this is not a sign that the violence is not serious, but rather a reflection of the complex psychological dynamics of domestic violence. The training also included practical skills, how to properly document domestic violence incidents, how to collect evidence, and how to write reports that can be used in court proceedings, how to explain to victims their rights and the options available. Continuing education has also become the norm. It wasn't just about what you learn in the academy and then never again. Officers received regular updates, new information, advanced training throughout their careers. Raising awareness of domestic violence as a serious crime. Perhaps the broadest impact of the Thurman case was on public awareness. The case received significant media attention. People read about what happened to Tracey. They saw photographs of her injuries. They heard about how the police failed. It sparked a national conversation about domestic violence. Suddenly it wasn't something that was kept quiet, something that happened behind closed doors and no one talked about. It was on the front pages of the newspapers, on the TV news, in dinner table conversations. Society began to understand that domestic violence was not just a family squabble. It's a serious crime. It's assault. And victims deserve the same protection and respectability as victims of any other crime. This shift in awareness has affected all levels of society. Lawmakers have begun to pass stricter laws. Judges began to impose harsher sentences. Communities began to create more resources for victims, shelters, hotlines, counseling services. And perhaps most importantly, victims began to feel empowered to seek help. They began to understand that what was happening to them was not their fault, that they deserve to be safe, that the system is there to protect them, not ignore them. Tracey Thurman's case became a symbol of how badly the system can fail, but also a symbol of hope, that change is possible, that justice can prevail, that one person can make a difference. After all the court battles, after all the changes in the law, after all the headlines, what really happened to Tracey? Because at the end of the day, it's not just a story about legal precedents and systemic change. It's a story about a real woman who had to live with her injuries, with her memories, and try to build some kind of life after unimaginable trauma. Tracey changed her name to Tracey Motozik. One of the first steps Tracey took as she tried to build a new life was to change her last name. She no longer wanted to be Tracey Thurman. The name carried too much pain, too many memories, too much connection to the man who tried to kill her. Changing a name is a powerful symbolic act. It's a way of saying, it's not me anymore. The person who lived through this is part of my past, but it doesn't define my future. It's a way of taking back control of your own identity. She chose the name Motuzik. We don't know exactly why she chose that name. Maybe it was a family name from her side of the family. Maybe it was the name of someone who helped her. Maybe it was just a name she liked that didn't carry any painful associations. The process of changing a name requires legal action. You have to file an application with the court. You have to have valid reasons. You have to go through a process that can take weeks or months. For Tracey, it meant more court visits, more paperwork, more bureaucratic hurdles. But she was determined to do it. Changing her name also meant changing her identity on all official documents. Driver's license, social security, bank accounts, medical records, everything had to be updated. It's a process that takes time and energy, but for Tracey, it was a price she was willing to pay for a fresh start. But changing her name couldn't change everything. People still recognized her. Her story was too public, too familiar. She couldn't just disappear and start all over again somewhere no one would know her. Her face was in the papers. Her story was told over and over again. Tracey Motuzik was still the woman who survived Buck Thurman, no matter what name she used. She became an advocate for the rights of domestic violence victims. Tracey could take her compensation, disappear from public life, and try to live as quietly as possible. No one would have blamed her. She's been through enough. She deserved some peace. But that wasn't what Tracey did. Instead, she chose to use her experience, her story, her voice to help other women. She became an advocate for the rights of victims of domestic violence, an activist, a spokesperson, someone who fights for change. She began to speak publicly about her experience. She accepted invitations to conferences, seminars, community events. She stood in front of audiences, sometimes small, sometimes large, and told her story. Again and again she described what had happened to her. Over and over again she relived the pain so that she could educate others. Imagine the courage. To stand in front of a room full of strangers and talk about the worst moment of your life. Talking about how you were stabbed, kicked, almost killed. Talk about your injuries, your disability, your suffering. And do it not once, but over and over again, year after year. Why did she do it? Because she knew her story had power. It had the power to show people the reality of domestic violence, that it's not an abstract problem, but something that happens to real people. It had the power to inspire other victims to seek help. It had the power to convince legislators, police officers, judges that change is necessary. Tracey also worked directly with organizations helping victims of domestic violence. She visited shelters, talked to women who sought refuge there. She shared her story, but she also listened to their stories. She offered support, encouragement, hope. She told them, "Look at me. I've been through the worst, and I survived. And not only that, I fought and changed the system. You can do it too. Your lives have value. You deserve to be safe. And the system is here to protect you." Her presence had a huge impact. For women in shelters who often feel shame, guilt, hopelessness, to see someone like Tracey, someone who has been through hell and come out stronger, it was incredibly powerful. She was honored as a survivor and fighter. Tracey's work has not gone unnoticed. She began receiving awards from various organizations that recognized her courage and her contribution to the fight against domestic violence. She was described as a survivor and a fighter, a description that perfectly captured her dual role. She was a survivor, someone who had been through unimaginable violence and managed to come out of it. But she was not just a passive survivor. She was a fighter, someone who actively fought for change, who refused to be a victim, who transformed her suffering into strength. Various domestic violence organizations gave her awards. Women's organizations celebrated her as a hero. Legal organizations recognized her role in changing the law. Community groups thanked her for her work in raising awareness. Each such award was recognition of what she had accomplished. But for Tracey, perhaps it meant more than just personal validation. It was a public statement that her suffering was not in vain, that something good had come out of something so terrible, that her pain had meaning. Valuation also brought attention. When Tracey got the award, the media covered it. Her story was retold, and that meant more people learned about domestic violence. More people understood the importance of protecting victims. More people were inspired to take action. But the award also brought pressure. Suddenly you're a public figure, representing the entire community of domestic violence survivors. People look to you as a role model, as a symbol. That's a huge responsibility, especially when you're still dealing with your own traumas and problems. Her story inspired a TV movie, 1989. In the year 1989, just a few years after the attack, a television film was made based on Tracey's story. The film was called A Cry for Help, the Tracey Thurman Story, which could be translated as A Cry for Help, the Tracey Thurman Story. Making a film about her story was a significant moment. Television in the 1980s had a huge reach. Millions of people could watch her story from the comfort of their living rooms. This meant an unprecedented level of awareness about domestic violence and how the system can fail. Of course, the film was not a documentary. It was a dramatic retelling with actors playing Tracey, Buck, the police officers. Some details may have been changed for dramatic effect, but the basic story remained the same. A woman repeatedly pleads for help, is ignored, and almost pays with her life. It must have been strange and perhaps disturbing for Tracey to see her life transferred to film. To see an actress playing you, to see the worst moments of your life reconstructed for entertainment, albeit with a serious message. It must have been surreal and perhaps re-traumatizing. But Tracey collaborated on the film. She probably consulted, shared her story with the filmmakers, maybe had some say in how the story was told. She decided that the potential impact of the film, how many people it could educate, how many lives it could save, was worth the personal inconvenience. The film did have a big impact. After it aired, the number of calls to domestic violence hotlines increased. More women sought help. More people began to understand the dynamics of domestic violence. The film became an educational tool that was used in police academies, in law schools, in community centers. It continues to raise awareness about domestic violence, and Tracey hasn't stopped. Years, even decades after the attack, she continued her work as an advocate and outreach worker. Domestic violence is a problem that will never completely go away. Despite all the changes in laws, all the new policies, all the training, domestic violence still exists. Women are still being abused, still being hurt, still being killed by their partners, and that means the work never stops. Tracey understood that. She knew that her work wasn't done just because a law was passed or a policy changed. She knew that every generation needed to be educated, every new group of police officers needed to be trained, every new victim needed to hear that they were not alone. So she kept talking. She continued to attend conferences, seminars, community events. She continued to share her story, even if it meant reliving the trauma. She continued to fight for victims who couldn't or were afraid to fight for themselves. Her message evolved with time. She didn't just talk about her own story. She talked about broader issues. Why domestic violence exists. What are the social structures that enable it? How can we create a culture where violence is unacceptable? She also spoke to different audiences. Not just to victims, but also to potential attackers. To young men who need to hear that violence is never acceptable, that relationships are about respect, not control. She spoke to neighbors and friends, people who may see the warning signs but don't know how to intervene. Tracey also used her voice to support specific legislative changes. When new domestic violence laws were being debated, her testimony carried weight. Legislators could not ignore a woman who literally almost died because of the system's failures, and then fought to change it. Her work had an impact not only on a national level, but on the level of individual lives. Women who heard her story found the courage to leave abusive relationships. Police officers who heard her speak began to take domestic violence calls more seriously. Judges who knew her story began to impose harsher sentences on attackers. Tracey Motuzik became more than just a survivor. She became a symbol, a voice, a force for change. And her work continued year after year because she knew that as long as domestic violence existed, there was a need for people to speak up, to fight, and to work for change. Her legacy is not just in the laws that were changed or the policies that were enacted. It is in every woman who found the courage to seek help after hearing Tracey's story. It is in every life that has been saved because of the changes her case inspired. It is in the fact that today, when a woman calls the police about domestic violence, she is much more likely to get the help she needs. That is the true legacy of Tracey Thurman Motuzik. And here we are at the end of this incredible, painful, but ultimately inspiring story. I have to pause for a moment and reflect on what we've just been through together. Because the Tracey Thurman case is not just a historical curiosity or another crime story, it's much more than that. The importance of taking domestic violence seriously. If there's only one thing to take away from this story, it's this. Domestic violence is a serious, potentially deadly crime. It's not a family fight. It's not a private matter. It's not something that should be dealt with behind closed doors without outside intervention. Tracey almost died because the people around her, especially those who had the power and responsibility to protect her, did not take her situation seriously. They saw it as something less important than the real crime. And it almost cost Tracey her life. Today, thanks to her case and the thousands of other brave survivors who have spoken out, we know better. We know that domestic violence kills. We know it escalates. We know that the most dangerous moment for a victim is often when they try to leave, and we know that early intervention can save lives. But we still have a long way to go. Even today, women are being killed by their partners. Even today, Cries for help are sometimes ignored. Even today, there are prejudices and misunderstandings around domestic violence, so we must continue to take this issue seriously at all levels of society. Systemic failures can cost lives. Tracey's case also shows us how dangerous systemic failures can be. This wasn't just about one bad police officer or one bad decision. It was about an entire system, a culture, policies, attitudes that systematically failed to protect victims of domestic violence. 8 months. Tracey begged for help for 8 months. She had all the right paperwork, court orders, protection orders. She did everything the system told her to do. And yet the system failed her in the worst possible way. It reminds us that it's not enough to have good laws on paper. We must also have systems that enforce those laws. We have to have a culture that takes domestic violence seriously. We must have people in positions of power who understand the seriousness of the problem and are willing to act. Systemic failures are not just abstract administrative problems. They have real, sometimes deadly, consequences. And it is our collective responsibility, as a society, as voters, as citizens, to ensure that our systems work as they should to protect the most vulnerable among us. The importance of legal protection for victims. Tracey's legal battle has shown us how important legal protection is for victims of domestic violence. Prior to her case, victims had little recourse when the system failed them. The police were essentially immune from lawsuits for failing to provide protection. But Tracey and her lawyers found a way. They used the Constitution, specifically the Equal Protection Clause, to argue that systematic failure to protect victims of domestic violence is a violation of fundamental rights. And they won. It created a legal tool that other victims could use. It created accountability for police departments. It created an incentive for change. And most importantly, it created hope. Hope that justice is possible, that the system can be changed, that one person can make a difference. Legal protection is not just about money or punishment. It's about sending a clear message. Victims' lives have value. Their safety is important. And when the system fails, there will be consequences. How this case has changed the lives of thousands of women. And here's the most important legacy of the Tracey Thurman case. It changed lives. Not just her life, but the lives of countless other women across the United States and perhaps beyond. How many women are alive today because of the changes her case inspired? How many women have received help from police who once would have ignored them? How many women have found the courage to leave abusive relationships after hearing Tracey's story and understanding that they are not alone? We cannot accurately count these lives, but we know they're out there. We know that every police officer who has been trained to better respond to domestic violence can save a life. We know that every mandatory arrest policy can prevent violence from escalating. We know that every woman who is encouraged to seek help has a better chance of survival. Tracey has taken her suffering, something so horrible that most of us can't even imagine it, and transformed it into a force for change. She refused to just be a victim. She chose to be a warrior, and because of her fight, thousands of women are safe today. Information about help for victims of domestic violence. Now, I want to speak directly to you if you are someone who is going through domestic violence or if you know someone who is. You are not alone. What is happening to you is not your fault. You deserve to be safe, and there is help. There are several organizations and helplines in the Czech Republic that can help. White Circle of Safety, a 24-hour helpline for victims of crime, 116-06, Donna Line, Counseling for Women, 251-511-313, Rosa, Center for Battered and Lonely Women, 602-246-102 or 241-432-466, Police of the Czech Republic, 158. If you are in immediate danger, call the police. And remember, thanks to cases like Tracey Thurman's, police are now trained and required to take domestic violence seriously. There are also shelters where you can find a safe haven. There are lawyers who can help you get protection orders. There are therapists who understand the trauma of domestic violence and can help you heal. A call for vigilance and support for victims. And for the rest of you, those of you who are not directly affected by domestic violence, I have a call to action as well. Be vigilant. Pay attention to the warning signs around you. If your neighbor, colleague, friend, family member is showing signs of being in an abusive relationship, isolation, unexplained injuries, fear of a partner, controlling behavior from a partner, Don't turn a blind eye. You don't have to become a hero, but you can be someone who asks, "Are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help?" You can be someone who provides information about available resources. You can be someone who calls the police if you hear violence. Support victims. Don't believe myths about domestic violence, that they should just leave, that it can't be that bad or they would leave, that it's their private business. Understand that leaving a violent relationship is a complex, dangerous process that requires support, resources, and time. And support organizations that fight domestic violence. Donate money, volunteer time, raise awareness. Every small action can make a difference. Tracey Thurman's story is a story of horror, but also a story of hope. It is a story of how the system can fail, but also how it can be changed. It's a story of suffering, but it's also a story of strength, courage, and determination. Tracey has survived something most of us wouldn't. And not only that, she took her experience and used it to change the world. Thanks to her, thousands of women are safe today. Because of her, domestic violence is taken more seriously. Because of her, justice has a better chance of prevailing. That's the power of one voice. That's the power of one story. That's the power of one woman who refused to be silent. And that's the message I want you to take away. One person can make a difference. Your voice makes a difference. Your experience has value. And change is always possible, even when it seems impossible. Thank you for walking with me through this difficult but important story. I hope that it has inspired you, that it has educated you, and that it may have changed your perspective on domestic violence and the importance of fighting for justice. If you liked the video, please like it, share it, because the more people who hear this story, the better. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more stories like this one. And most importantly, remember, if you or someone you know needs help, don't hesitate to seek it. You are not alone. Help is out there, and you deserve to be safe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Be safe.